Welcome to True Crime Mysteries, where we investigate cases that stumped investigators for years. Today, we're exploring one of California's most haunting cold cases, the murder of a 22-year-old woman who disappeared into a summer night in 1997 and was found along a quiet stretch of coastal road, her killer unknown. For 27 years, that killer had no name. How does a case go cold for nearly 3 decades, and what does it take to finally crack it? Here's what happened. And the case sat in the growing archive of California's unsolved homicides, a file with a name on it, and a family still searching for answers. Until 2024, what happened in 2024 didn't happen because of a witness coming forward, or a confession, or a jailhouse tip. It happened because of science. Specifically, it happened because of a technique called investigative genetic genealogy, a tool that has quietly been reshaping what's possible in cold case investigations, giving names to suspects who thought time had protected them, and giving families answers they had nearly stopped believing would ever come. Today, on True Crime Mysteries, we are going to walk through the complete story of Angela Saco's case. We are going to honor who she was. We are going to examine what investigators faced in the summer of 1997, and why this case joined so many others in going cold. We are going to explain exactly what investigative genetic genealogy is, and how it was applied to this case. And we are going to look at the 2024 announcement from the San Mateo County Sheriff's Office that finally gave this case a resolution, even if that resolution carries its own complicated weight. This is a story about a young woman. It is a story about the limits of technology in one era, and the power of technology in another. It is a story about the investigators who never let a file die. And it is a story about what justice looks like when the answer comes 27 years too late for a trial, but not too late for the truth. Let's start at the beginning. The nightclub scene along the waterfront and in the neighborhoods south of Market Street was alive in a way that was specific to that moment. On any given summer weekend, thousands of people moved through that world, meeting strangers, sharing spaces, and eventually going their separate ways into the night. Angela Saco was 22 years old in the summer of 1997. According to public reporting from the San Francisco Chronicle covering the case, she had been seen leaving a nightclub in San Francisco. That detail, last seen leaving a nightclub, is a specific and important one, and it is the last confirmed public record of where Angela was before she was found. Now look at a map of the Bay Area. San Francisco sits on the northern tip of the San Francisco Peninsula. If you drive south from the city on the coastal side of that peninsula, you pass through Daly City, through Pacifica, and eventually you leave the suburban sprawl behind. The roads narrow, the hills rise. The Pacific Ocean comes into view on your right, gray and immense. You are now on the San Mateo County coast side, a stretch of California that is, by the standards of the Bay Area, genuinely remote. Farmland, redwood groves, creek bottoms that hold fog long into the morning. Pescadero Creek Road is one of those roads. It winds through the rural interior of coastal San Mateo County, passing through landscape that is a world removed from the nightclubs of San Francisco. It is the kind of road where you might go an hour without seeing another car. It is, as public reporting has described it, a quiet stretch of coastal road. It was along Pescadero Creek Road that Angela Saco was found in July of 1997. According to public reporting in the sheriff's office's own public statements over the years, Angela had been found in that location, and the manner of her death was a homicide. Think about what that means from an investigative standpoint, right from the beginning. You have a victim who was last seen in San Francisco County, in the jurisdiction of the San Francisco Police Department. And you have a victim who was found in rural San Mateo County, in the jurisdiction of the San Mateo County Sheriff's Office. That geographic gap between where someone was last confirmed to be alive and where they were found is a challenge in any homicide investigation. It means that the full picture of what happened, from the nightclub to Pescadero Creek Road, spans a distance and a jurisdictional boundary. It means that investigators from the outset were working to reconstruct a journey they had no direct evidence of. The San Mateo County Sheriff's Office took jurisdiction based on where Angela was found, which is standard practice. They began the work that investigators begin in every homicide case, documenting the scene, collecting physical evidence, and working outward from what they knew to try to understand what they didn't. Before we go any further into the investigation, I want to pause and say something directly to anyone watching this video. Angela Saco was a 22-year-old person. She had a family. She had people who loved her. The details that are public in this case, that she was found along a rural road, that she had last been seen leaving a nightclub, those details can, if we are not careful, reduce a person to a circumstance. That is not what we are here to do. True Crime Mysteries makes a commitment on every case we cover. We talk about victims as people first. We do not linger on the manner of death for dramatic effect. We do not use the violence done to Angela Saco as a hook. What we can say, based on public records and news reporting, is that Angela was a young woman in her early 20s, living in the Bay Area, living a life that should have continued for decades. She was 22. Her family spent the next 27 years without answers. That is what we are here to examine. The sheriff's office was working the case. But as the weeks became months, and the months crept toward the end of 1997, no arrest was made. No suspect was publicly named. No charges were filed. Angela Saco's case began its long, painful journey toward becoming a cold case. CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, the FBI's national DNA database, had been authorized by Congress in 1994 and was in the process of being built out, but it was nowhere near the scale it would eventually reach. To get a hit from a DNA database in 1997, you needed a sample from a suspect, and you needed that suspect's DNA to already be in the system. If your suspect had no prior DNA-linked record, a database search produced nothing. That was the reality in Angela Saco's case. Physical evidence, including biological evidence, was collected and preserved. But if the person who left that evidence was not already in a DNA database, the evidence sat. It was preserved, it was kept, but it could not, with the tools of 1997, tell investigators who they were looking for. There was also no genetic genealogy. There were no public consumer DNA databases, the kind that companies like Ancestry and 23andMe would eventually build, databases containing the genetic profiles of millions of ordinary people who had simply wanted to learn about their heritage. Those databases did not exist in 1997. The idea that you could take a DNA sample from a crime scene, upload it to a genealogy database, and use family tree research to work backward to a suspect's identity, that was not a concept that existed in law enforcement practice in the late 1990s. It would be nearly 20 years before investigative genetic genealogy would be developed and applied to cold cases. So the investigators working Angela Saco's case in 1997 and in the years that followed were working within the constraints of their moment. They had physical evidence. They had a timeline, partial and imperfect. They had witnesses from the nightclub. And they had the geographic puzzle of how a young woman last seen in San Francisco ended up on Pescadero Creek Road. Cases like Angela's, victims last seen in nightlife settings, found at locations some distance from where they were last confirmed alive, presented specific investigative challenges in this era that went beyond just DNA technology. The nightclub environment meant that Angela had likely interacted with many people that night, some of whom were strangers, some of whom may not have come forward. The distance between San Francisco and the coast side of San Mateo County, a drive of an hour or more under normal circumstances, suggested that whoever was responsible had knowledge of that area or had reason to go there. But without a suspect to focus on, that geographic detail was a clue without a key. Detectives who had worked the original case eventually moved on, retired, transferred, left the department. The file passed to new hands. This is a pattern that plays out in cold case investigations across California and across the country. It is not neglect, exactly, it is the structural reality of how investigative resources work. But for families, the passage of years and the changing of personnel can feel like abandonment. Angela's family had no control over any of this. They could only wait. California has a particular and painful history with unsolved homicides from the 1990s. The combination of rapidly growing cities, active nightlife scenes, limited forensic technology, and in some cases overburdened law enforcement agencies created conditions in which cases slipped through the cracks. Some of those cases have since been resolved, through new witnesses, through confessions, and increasingly through genetic genealogy. Others remain open. Angela's case was one of the ones that waited. Public awareness of cold cases like Angela's has been sustained in part by online communities. Discussion threads on forums like Reddit's r Unresolved Mysteries and r Cold Cases have referenced news coverage of her case over the years. These communities, which draw researchers, true crime enthusiasts, and sometimes family members and survivors, serve a real function in keeping public attention on cases that official channels may have difficulty maintaining visibility for. They circulate news articles, discuss investigative timelines, and sometimes surface information that makes its way to investigators. In Angela's case, the online discussions appear to have primarily tracked news coverage rather than generated new investigative leads, but the fact that people were still paying attention, still saying her name, still asking what happened, carries its own kind of meaning. When a detective picks up a file like Angela's, whether in 2005 or 2015 or 2020, they are picking up not just an unsolved crime but a family's ongoing suffering. The best investigators in this space carry that weight without letting it distort their judgment. They know that the evidence has to lead where it leads, and that closure for a family is not guaranteed just because you want it to be. The San Mateo County Sheriff's Office maintained Angela's case as an active cold case investigation through the years. According to their 2024 public announcement, the case was eventually positioned for re-examination using new forensic techniques. And that re-examination, when it came, would change everything. Traditional DNA database searches work like this. Investigators collect a DNA sample from a crime scene, biological material left by a suspect, and they run that sample against a database of known DNA profiles. In the United States, the primary such database is CODIS, maintained by the FBI. CODIS contains DNA profiles collected from convicted offenders and, in many states, from individuals arrested for certain crimes. If the DNA from the crime scene matches a profile in CODIS, investigators have a lead, a name, a person whose DNA is on record. If there is no match, the search ends there. This system works well when the suspect has a prior record that put their DNA into the database. It does not work when the suspect has never had their DNA collected. A person who committed a crime in the late 1990s was never arrested or convicted for anything that required DNA collection, and lived out their life without ever entering the database would never appear in a CODIS search. That person is, from the perspective of traditional DNA investigation, invisible. Investigative genetic genealogy approaches the problem from an entirely different angle. Here is how it works. Investigators take the DNA sample from the crime scene, the biological material left by the unknown suspect, and they create a genetic profile from it. But instead of running that profile against a law enforcement database, they upload it to a public genealogy database. Databases like GEDmatch, which allows users to upload their DNA results from consumer testing services for genealogical comparison, contain the profiles of millions of ordinary people who have never been convicted of any crime. These are people who took an ancestry DNA test or a 23andMe kit because they were curious about their heritage, or wanted to connect with relatives, and who opted into having their profile compared with others. The uploaded crime scene DNA profile is compared against those millions of profiles. The goal is not to find an exact match, that would require the suspect themselves to be in the database. The goal is to find partial matches, people who share enough DNA with the crime scene profile to indicate that they are distant relatives of the suspect. Cousins, perhaps, second cousins, the genetic traces of shared ancestry. Once investigators identify those partial matches, those probable relatives, the work of genealogical research begins. This is where genetic genealogy differs most sharply from traditional DNA investigation. It requires not just forensic science but detailed family tree research. Investigators, or specialists they work with, build out family trees from those partial matches, working backward and forward through generations, mapping who is related to whom, looking for descendants who could be the right age to have committed the crime, who lived in or near the right geographic area at the right time. It is meticulous, complex, time-consuming work. And it does not always lead to a definitive answer quickly. But when it works, it can identify a suspect from DNA alone, without any prior criminal record, without any witness coming forward, without any confession. It reconstructs, through science and genealogical research, the biological identity of a person who had been anonymous. Cases from the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, cases where biological evidence had been preserved but where traditional investigation had reached a dead end, have been resolved using this approach. The technique has named killers who had lived for decades without suspicion. It has given families answers they had stopped expecting. The San Mateo County Sheriff's Office applied this technique to Angela Saco's case. The biological evidence that had been collected and preserved from the scene in 1997, preserved through all the years the case sat cold, became the foundation for a new investigation using new science. According to the San Mateo County Sheriff's Office's public announcement in 2024, investigative genetic genealogy was used to identify a suspect in the case. The identification led investigators to Gary Gene Ramirez. The investigation had not, based on any public record, previously named Ramirez as a suspect. He was not someone who had been the subject of public investigative scrutiny. Whatever life he led after July of 1997, he led it without being publicly identified in connection with this case. And then the science found him. Or more precisely, the science found traces of his biological relatives in a genealogy database. And from those traces, trained researchers and investigators built a path through family trees, through decades of records, through the intersection of genetics and genealogy, and arrived at a name. Gary Gene Ramirez. The San Mateo County Sheriff's Office, according to their 2024 statements, concluded that he was the person responsible for Angela Saco's death. Now we arrive at the part of this story that adds its own complicated layer of difficulty. Gary Gene Ramirez was deceased at the time investigators identified him. When a suspect is deceased at the time of identification, none of that process occurs. There is no arrest, there is no trial, there is no verdict. The conclusion reached by investigators, Gary Gene Ramirez was responsible, is a law enforcement conclusion, supported by the evidence as investigators understand it, but it is not a conclusion that has been tested in an adversarial legal proceeding. No defense attorney has cross-examined the genealogy analysis. No jury has weighed the full body of evidence. The case is, from a legal standpoint, closed, but it is closed without the formal process that normally gives a closure its weight. This is what law enforcement and legal professionals sometimes refer to as a case that has been solved without prosecution. It happens in a meaningful number of cold case resolutions, for various reasons. Suspects die, statutes of limitations expire, though California has no statute of limitations for murder. Evidence may be sufficient to identify but not sufficient, standing alone, to meet the beyond a reasonable doubt standard required for conviction. Or, as here, the suspect is simply gone. For official purposes, the San Mateo County Sheriff's Office announced in 2024 that the case of Angela Saco had been resolved. The case file, which had been open for 27 years, was closed. The identification of Gary Gene Ramirez was the answer the investigation had been working toward. For the San Mateo County Sheriff's Office, the announcement represented the culmination of work that had spanned multiple investigative eras, from the initial investigation in 1997 through the cold case years and ultimately to the modern forensic application that produced the identification. The agency's public statements acknowledged the role of investigative genetic genealogy in the resolution and reflected the persistent effort that had kept the case active over the decades. For Angela's family, the 2024 announcement brought something that 27 years of waiting had not: a name. An answer to the question of who. The San Mateo County Sheriff's Office's public communication in 2024 was directed, at least in part, toward giving that family the public acknowledgement that an answer had been found. What the announcement could not give them, what no announcement ever could, is a trial. A day in court, a verdict spoken aloud in a room where they were present. The particular form of closure that the legal system, when it works, can provide. That form of closure will not come in Angela's case. The man investigators identified as responsible is gone, beyond any earthly legal reach. Law enforcement agencies have adopted their own guidelines about when and how to use it. The California Department of Justice has addressed investigative genetic genealogy in its guidance to law enforcement agencies. The technique has been used in California in a number of high-profile cold case resolutions, and there is an established, if evolving, set of practices around how it should be applied. What is not in dispute, what the record of the past several years has made undeniably clear, is that it works. Cases that had no other path forward have been resolved. Suspects who had lived for decades under the assumption that time had made them safe have been identified. And families who had nearly given up on answers have received them. Angela Saco's case is one of those cases. The biological evidence preserved from 1997, combined with the science developed in the years that followed, created the path that led to a name 27 years later. 27 years of carrying a loss that had no legal resolution, no public accounting, no named person at the center of what had happened. And then, in 2024, a name. Whether that name, Gary Gene Ramirez, brings anything approaching peace to Angela's family is something only they can know. Closure is a word that gets used frequently in discussions of cold case resolutions, and it is a word that survivors and victims' families sometimes push back on hard. Because the resolution of an investigation does not close the wound. It does not return who was lost. It does not undo 27 years. What it can do, and what the 2024 announcement did, is answer a question. It can tell a family, "We found out who did this." We know, the case is no longer open. That is not nothing. In fact, for many families who have waded through decades of uncertainty, it is everything. In 2024, the San Mateo County Sheriff's Office held a press conference and made a public announcement that changed the status of a 27-year-old case. Investigative genetic genealogy, the same technique that had identified the Golden State Killer 6 years earlier, that had resolved cold cases across California and across the country, had been applied to biological evidence preserved from Angela Saco's 1997 homicide. That application had led investigators to a name, Gary Gene Ramirez. Ramirez was, according to the sheriff's office's announcement, deceased at the time of identification. No prosecution would occur. No trial would take place. The legal machinery of justice would not engage in the way it does when a living suspect is named. But the case, the file that had been open since July of 1997, was officially resolved. The San Mateo County Sheriff's Office concluded its investigation and closed it, with an answer where for 27 years there had been only a question. The 2024 announcement was covered by KTVU and the San Francisco Chronicle, both of which had covered the original 1997 case and the subsequent years of investigation. The coverage reflected the significance of the resolution and the complexity of its circumstances. A cold case solved, a suspect named, a man who would never face a jury. Angela Saco was 22 years old when she was killed in July of 1997. She deserved to live a full life. She deserved to grow old, to see decades pass, to have decades of July summers that were nothing more than ordinary. She did not get those things. What she got, in the end, was this. 27 years after her death, the person investigators concluded was responsible was identified. Her case was closed. Her name was spoken again, at a press conference, in connection with an answer rather than a question. That is the story of Angela Saco's case as it stands in the public record. It is not a simple story. It is not a story with a satisfying courtroom ending. It is a story about the limits of justice and the possibilities of science. It is a story about the people who never stopped working a file, and about a family that never stopped waiting. It is a story about a young woman whose life mattered, and whose case, 27 years later, finally had a name put to it. They are not law enforcement databases. The question of whether contributing to those databases makes you an inadvertent participant in criminal investigations, without your knowledge, without your consent in that specific sense, is one that courts, legislatures, and ethicists are actively working through right now. It is not a question with an easy answer. At the same time, the families of people like Angela Saco, families who waited 27 years, who had biological evidence sitting preserved in a case file with no way forward, those families are also real. Their need for answers is real. The value of resolving a case like this one is real. How we balance those interests, the privacy interests of millions of ordinary database users against the justice interests of victims' families and the public safety interests of identifying violent offenders, is one of the defining forensic policy questions of our current moment. Angela's case did not resolve that question, but it is one of the cases that puts the question into sharpest relief. And if you want to see more responsibly told cold case resolutions, please subscribe to True Crime Mysteries, hit the like button, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. And please remember Angela Saco, not for how her life ended, but as a young woman who deserved so much more, and whose family waited 27 years for an answer that finally came.